How about on that? 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. How's that? Great. A little bit down a bit. 1, 2, 1, 2. Hello. Can you hear me at the back? Can you guys hear me at the back? How's that sound? Yep. No, there's nobody there.
Okay, hello everybody.
Hello.
Hiya. So we're going to have Mick talking tonight about the Angular pipeline, building apps, and testing stuff. It's a good presentation, I see that. I just wanted to do a quick announcement before he talks about, in August we're going to have Judy Ralph, who writes Tractors for Google, coming over and giving a talk for us over in Shoreditch. So sign up tomorrow morning, 10 AM. It's going to be great. Okay, then without further ado, Mick.
All right, thanks. Well, I promise we won't go on all night long, because I'm sure people will want to go and see the football later on. So I'm going to talk about building, testing, releasing, and deploying Angular apps, and getting started really quickly. A little bit about me. I'm the founder of a company called SQL Software that developed a software configuration management system called Dimension, still going. But news and social media aggregating, and I've worked at a way called AKQA. I'm now working at AMIA, who also develop Nectar. And I'm particularly passionate about automation, DevOps, and quality. There's how you can contact me. The talk's pretty wide-based, so I can't go into complete detail about absolutely everything, but there is an example on GitHub that hopefully is a reasonably complete example of everything that we're talking about here. And I've put links in the presentation directly into that GitHub. So afterwards, we'll put the slides up, and you'll be able to follow along and click through onto the examples. So a little bit of background. How do we want to? A bit of context about what we were trying to achieve this evening. I thought to myself, well, let's suppose we're a startup. There's half a dozen of us. We've got a bit of money. We've got an idea. Let's get going really quickly. I want to use all the services that are quick to get going. I don't want to spend a lot of money, but I still want to be able to utilize best practices. I want proper package management, version management of all of my dependencies. I want testing. I want auto-loading of my tests and my resources while I'm developing. I want all my unit tests configured with code coverage, and I want some end-to-end tests. I mean, continuous integration builds every time I commit. And I'd suggest that we manage our API separately. We've got a separate team to do our API, and we'll consider the Angular app as a single piece, which is completely purely the front end. And we'll run end-to-end tests against our API as a start within our Angular project. And that's something that was talked about here a couple of meetups ago. We want to have a distribution build that's going to combine, minify, and hash all of our JavaScript, our CSS and images, so that we get a nice, slow score and a super fast page load.
Don't mind me, Mick.
So, what's the quickest way to get going? Let's just use GitHub. It's $12 a month, right? It gives us user management, issue management, releases, a wiki, and what we need to use is the git commit message conventions, which are linked to in there, suggested by the Angular team, and that's what they look like. There's a subject here, a particular area that's covered, and some description. hash and a number will link to an issue inside GitHub. And if you put fixes in front of it, it's going to close that issue automatically for you. Fixes, fixed, closed, closes, they all work. And if you don't put fixes and closed in there, it'll create a link for you. And you've got a lovely stream of commits against a change, all nicely printed out for you inside GitHub. And then, if we've used these conventions, we get a nice change log generated for us by a tool. So what tools are we going to use? We're going to have to use npm. So npm doesn't stand for Node Package Manager, I'm told. But that's what I think of it as. It's a repository for Node packages that allows us to install, manage versions and dependencies for Node programs. Now, Angular is not a Node application, but we're using Node purely for the dev tools. So all of the tools that we're using within our tool chain are Node applications. So we're using npm to install those tools for us. The configuration for npm is package.json, and it sticks all its files and directories under a folder called Node modules, unless you do some configuration in the background. That's the fine way of doing it. Bower sounds like the very same thing. It's a repository of open source projects that are included in your browser. Again, you need to manage your versions and dependencies, and we're going to use Bower for all of the JS libraries that we use within our application. Those are the things that are going to get loaded into the browser at runtime, like Angular, jQuery, any of the NG plugins that we want to use. The configuration for that is bower.json. And again, there's a folder for that called Bower Components. Our index.html is going to contain references to all of these files, and it will load files directly from Bower Components. And our test configuration, which is called parma-config, also has references to those files loaded in from Bower Components. I suggest you don't check all your Node modules and your Bower components into your source control system, but every now and again, well, say every night, back them up, keep a directory of those things, because one day they will disappear, one particular version will disappear, and your build will break. But checking them into source control is going to blow your source control. We need a build tool. Grunt or Gulp are the current favourites at the moment. Grunt's the long-running one. It's much more mature. It's configured in a file called gruntfile.js. It's got loads of examples. And the thing about that one is that it keeps a block of configuration, and then the control flow is kept separate. And it's quite asynchronous. So I think that's a good one to get going with, and it's simple to understand. However, when it gets a bit bigger, I think everybody's going to find that Grunt is quite tough. The new one is Gulp, and that's configured in gulpfile.js. It's much less mature. And it describes build streams or build pipelines, and it's very much more code that you're using to write your build system rather than configuration blocks. So it's probably a steeper learning curve, but in the end it may well actually become simpler to use. It's asynchronous as well, so you've got to understand its model of how build streams are done in parallel. Yeoman's another great resource, and that's a scaffolding tool that generates applications, including Angular ones for us. And it's certainly good for initial investigation. And it creates a nice grunt file for us that I certainly used as the starting point for my work with grunt. But it gets quite big and quite complicated. NPM tips, I'd suggest, so NPM has the concept of development tools and dependencies. So they're saved in separate blocks. As NPM is a purely for node applications, and this is for our development environment, it's always going to be save dev, which puts it into our package.json file for us. We're installing something, and I'd also suggest that we use save exact. By default, it uses semantic versioning, and the last digit is a patch number. So it allows you to vary the patch number or the module's authors and publish a new module with a new patch version number, and it will get downloaded into your build system. So that happens without you having to know about it. Now, when you get a fairly large build system going, you'll find that not everybody is fantastically studious about testing before they publish their modules. And so even patch version releases can break your build. So the safest way is to save exact. So you put in your file, I want this version, and it stays that version until you change it. And then you deliberately go in and update your dependencies, and you test those and then commit those, rather than waiting for it to happen to you. It lets you do things like pre-install hooks. So the convention is when you download a node application, you do your git checkout, and then you go into that directory and do an npm install. And there's post-install hooks that allow you to run scripts for you after it's done your initial npm install. npm install is going to download all of our node packages, all our dev tools for us, and have them all configured for us. And post-install allows you to put something else in there, whatever you need to do. Bower also needs to do an install, so it's a good place to put in the Bower install command as well. There's a script section as well, so you can put in there commonly used scripts like if you're going to run a static analysis report, run script report, so that hides the horrible long syntax, the command line for you. And what I would also suggest is npm test is that you use with your team to say, this is the set of tests that I suggest you run before we commit into our version control system. So that's our agreement. You must run that before you commit. Directory structure. Okay. So we're going to have a directory called app, where all of our components are, all of our source for our Angular app is going to sit. I like to put Bower components and node modules at the top level, particularly Bower components. Quite often you see people put that within your app folder. I like to do a bit of searching around within my app code, and if you've got Bower components in there, it's hard to search within just your code. There's a lot of files in there that can grow very large and slow everything down. I like to keep it out of the way. So, then inside your app folder, there are some recommendations from the Angular team about the app structure, the directory layout. In general, there's a directory for each page or module or functional area of your application, and within that you put all of the files together. So controllers, there's a controller test, and it has an underscore test on the end of it, and the naming convention is important. There's the styling and the HTML that go together, and they're all kept in the same directory. So it's much easier when you've got a larger system that you know where all of the components for a particular module are. Shared components, you'll put in a directory, for instance, called components, and again, a set of directories where you put everything together, keep them all together inside those ones. If those directories are getting too big, i.e. something like 10 files, then break those up, put those into subdirectories. I like to use Bootstrap. Does a lot of stuff for you. We can use SAS, and we can have SAS do the compiling for us. If you use a global app.scss, you can link to a variables file so that it's going to bin your Bootstrap files for you. You'll have to manually include all of those SCCS files, CSS files that you've got in your module directories. And then, of course, use the auto prefixer to add vendor prefixes. So you don't have to worry about whether you're using WebKit directives or not. So we're going to set up a watch job that's going to look for our JavaScript files. As soon as we save the file, it's going to JS hint it, syntax check it. There's a configuration file for JS hint to make sure that our JS follows our conventions. We run our unit tests automatically on the as we save the file. And the same with the CSS files, compile it, and then of course both cases we're going to reload the browser. We don't have to sit there, save the file, recompile stuff, and refresh the browser. This should all be done automatically. And I personally like to include a watcher that does the reports errors in the top right-hand corner using a graph. Not everybody likes to see those popping up all the time. So, testing. So, lots of front-end devs here. Who writes unit tests of you? Okay, pretty good. Who writes end-to-end tests? Good. Yeah, that's excellent. So, Mr. Martin Fowler, professor from ThoughtWorks, talks about the testing pyramid, and what he's suggesting here is that there are very many more unit tests than there are UI tests. And so, you know, if we're spending too much time writing end-to-end tests, that we should be spending more time doing our unit tests. And he also suggests that if you're finding bugs in your end-to-end tests, that perhaps you're also missing unit tests, and you should be going back and introducing more unit tests so that you don't get an end-to-end test later. So, by definition, the same people writing unit tests are going to be writing end-to-end tests. So I think that's you. So there's no reason why, at the very least, web developers shouldn't be writing end-to-end tests that demonstrate that the work that they've done actually works. Okay? And regardless of whether you've got a QA department or not. And I'd suggest before you start a piece of work, right, write down what you're trying to achieve. Okay? You can describe it in a Jasmine type form here, right? And just write out some text. Right? These become your unit tests, or they can also become your end-to-end tests. And if you're not filling in your the actual implementation of those tests, they are by definition skipped. But at least now you're thinking about what we need to achieve when we start work. So once we've detailed our what we're trying to achieve, just write enough code to satisfy those tests, and then you'll probably think of some more things. Some more tests. We'll configure some code coverage, so now you can look at, of all of the code that I've done, have I roughly covered all the functionality that I've written? Yeah. If you don't have a coverage report, you can't tell. So that's why it's important to have a coverage report there to make sure that you're covering what you've done. And just the fact of writing down what you want to do before you start makes a massive difference to how you structure your work and how you write your code. Now, all of that stuff about testing is the same for whatever language you're writing. There's nothing special in there about Angular. But I think what's really exciting about Angular and what perhaps attracts a lot of you guys here is that Angular has been written with testing in mind. So there's a link to the section on the Angular site about unit testing. And they're including dependency injection. Now, if you're not doing a lot of testing, this dependency injection doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. As you're doing more and more testing here, that becomes the really important part of Angular. It's really important to modularize your code. Angular again is getting you to think about those things before you're doing them. Use define your API as a service. I've used REST Angular for doing those sorts of things. You can get it to run as a service, and it will return model objects. You can enhance those models, and you can enrich the objects that you get back, just like in a MVC. So, and as we know with Angular, we don't want to do very much DOM manipulation, and if we absolutely have to, that we're going to put into directives and test them in isolation. So, if you're not testing, this syntax doesn't make an awful lot of sense. What we're trying to say here is that there's a module called a module, and we're defining a controller. We've got a controller that we've got here called login control. And after that, there's an array of parameters. The last parameter is a function which gets passed a set of dependencies which are named the first set of parameters that are passed in. The names are important in text. So using this type of syntax stops the ng minifier getting confused. but it's a funky looking syntax, and you don't have an awful lot of choice. This is how you have to do it. So, using those dependency in tests, there's several ways of doing that as well. But I'd suggest you pick a way of doing it and stick to it. That everybody use the same way of doing this, sets and conventions. Here's a way of doing it using the injector, where you explicitly get each of the dependencies, the modules that you want to use within your tests. And I'm getting those before each method of the test. And then, once we've got our dependencies, Angular gives us some great ways of mocking and stubbing. So, I'm using here the spy-on method from Jasmine. What I think is useful about this is that it's suggesting that the user profile service has a method called getCurrentUser. Now, if that getCurrentUser is not a function, or we've changed our name, that call will fail. So we're not arbitrarily sticking a function into our service. There is some checking here that that service, that function on that service does actually exist. And in this case, we're saying, instead of calling getCurrentUser, call a fake called promised. And in here, we're saying the state service take the go function and replace it with absolutely nothing, a stub. And then later on, we can validate that these things have been called by saying, expect that our state go function has been called with a parameter main. That way, we don't get the whole routing mechanism firing every single time in our test. We just need to know that we're trying to send our user to the state main. We can also mock or stub a whole dependency as well. So up here we're defining an object which has which can have a set of messages. You can put anything in those messages. In this case, it's created a spy, but it doesn't have to be a spy. It can be your code. And then we're using the provide method to replace a dependency called growl with our API. And then later on, we're going to say, did our dependency get called with a message by calling here. Now, there is a big discussion about how much mocking and stubbing that people do. And I think, you've got to look carefully at what you're mocking and stubbing. And be sensible. If half of your tests, or there's too much of your test is taken up with code creating mocks and stubs, you need to think of a different way of doing it. So, we want to keep it as simple as possible, but these are useful mechanisms that you will have to use at some point or the other. Then, testing tips using Jasmine. Stick a D on the front for describe. That'll just run that set of tests that are inside the describe block. You can run just this one particular test by sticking an I in front of it. and you can ignore a test by sticking an X in front of it. Nice and simple. We run all of our tests with Karma. It's a big file, so there's a link to it there. But basically, it has a link to all of the JavaScript libraries that are loaded as part of our app. So pretty much everything that you're loading in your index.html file, you're probably going to have to load inside your Karma config as well. It's got references to the files under test as well, and the test files. You can list a set of browsers to use for when you're running your suite of tests. So all of those unit tests can run against multiple browsers simultaneously, or if you're just going to run this on a continuous integration server, perhaps you just want to use that in JS. It's up to you. I don't know whether people use lots of browsers for doing this sort of testing, or whether they just use JS. I tend to use JS. Inside there, we can configure coverage reports as well. Say these are the files to do coverage reports across. And then we're going to run from grunt using a grunt test task. WebStorm and IntelliJ here have got a great plugin for Karma as well, so you can just point your plugin at Karma config and it will do all of the coverage analysis for you. You can use it to debug directly from your IDE. Well recommended, very nice integration. This is the sort of coverage reports that running the Karma test suite is going to generate for you. It sticks it in a coverage directory, and it tells you number of statements, branches, and for each file there's a status of branches and functions. You can click on those ones and get a listing of source, and it's showing you how many times the statement was generated. This is just like, you know, stuff that we have in Java and .NET. Very valuable stuff. Makes working out what we're testing and how we're testing much simpler. And that's all configured on the GitHub example as well. I found a static analysis tool called Plato. Very nice. There's some online services that do it for you as well. You've got to pay for those ones. This one's an open source project. It's plugged into Grunt. You just say Grunt Plato or npm report. It produces a nice HTML file with a history. Lets you dig into each file and gives you some complexity analysis. And if that's your bag, you can use that how you see fit. So, end-to-end tests. We're all going to write some end-to-end tests. We use Protractor. And Protractor uses frameworks just like Karma does as well. So, from Protractor, we can either use Jasmine or Cucumber. And you could run multiple browsers in parallel. And the fabulous thing about it is that it understands Angular and waits for our digest to complete. It uses Selenium WebDriver, which is the industry standard for testing HTML. But because Protractor knows so much about Angular, it's much easier to use the standard WebDriver. There's even some tricks that Julie has talked about as well. You can, as you're starting your Protractor test, you can inject a block of JavaScript in there which turns off animations and perhaps adjust some of your code as you're starting your tests. Use with caution, but it's not a bad idea to turn off animation so that the whole suite will run quickly. Well, which framework should we use for end-to-end tests? So if you've got a product owner who's writing user stories and knows how to write acceptance criteria, or you've got a big QA team that understands all this stuff, that writes Cucumber, then go with Cucumber. But otherwise, I suggest Jasmine is just fine. Cucumber is much harder because there's an intermediate step with one level of indirection for all of your tests. It's much harder to debug, it's more complicated. Either way, use a pattern called page objects, where each module or each page you define in an object all of the interactions that happen with that page. So you hide the details about the HTML makeup of your page. How do you press a button? What the element is called? How do you find the element on the page? All of that detail is hidden within a page object. So when you change the layout of your HTML, you change it in one place, that's the theory, you change it in one place in your page objects, and magically all your tests will still work. For those of you who have not seen Cucumber before, this is what it looks like. This is, this is the classic user story layout features as I want to so that. And each scenario is an acceptance criteria given when then. And then Cucumber allows you to create a step that is a block of code that's linked to each of these pieces of text to actually execute code for you. And again, if you're using JCucumber, there's a WebStorm plugin for that as well. I'm not an agent for IntelliJ, but that's pretty nifty. You can just click on your step here, press Control B, and it will take you to the Cucumber step definition. And I put them in the in my example project. Both of them are in there. So there's a set of Cucumber tests and there's a set of Jasmine tests. You can run the Cucumber ones with grunt VTE and grunt VTE Jasmine for the Jasmine. So Jasmine tests are not quite so good as the Cucumber ones, but it's the same idea. Underneath it, they're using the same set of page objects. So there's no reason why you can't use both of them. So Source Labs. Source Labs does some fancy stuff for you, allowing you to do cross-browser testing. So you can set up a tunnel between your local machine or your integration server that connects to Source Labs, so that when the web page is run on their testing servers, it's connecting to your backend server, and it's not available across the internet. You can run lots and lots of browsers in parallel, so you can pay for them, and you can run mobile as well. And there's a configuration for it here. Now, there is a downside to this. It doesn't always work perfectly. So I can't say hand on heart that Source Labs browser testing works in every single case. Does anybody else use Source Labs here? No. A little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, over the last few weeks, for me, it's got more and more flaky. So intermittent failures are a thing of source labs. Now, if this works, it's a wonderful thing. It shows you a video, shows you the steps of what it is doing, and in theory, you can go through lots of different versions of browsers, you can do mobiles, and you don't have to set all these things up. You just sign up once, put in our configuration file, test it on IE 9, 11, and magically it's going to go away and do it. So it has the potential to be something wonderful, maybe not quite there yet. Continuous integration service. So I've always deployed my own servers or had my own servers where I've run Jenkins or Bamboo to do our integration testing. Now, but there are online services now that compete very well. Travis CI, just sign up for it. It's $129 a month. It sounds a little bit expensive, but if you're buying a server from Amazon, you're probably going to spend pretty much close to that anyway. And now you've got to get somebody to install CI software after it for you. And whereas the configuration for these tools is actually pretty simple. A lot of it's done for you. So they both use some sort of a YAML file for configuration, and they're using some sort of container management on their server as well. So the good thing is every single build job is done in isolation on a completely new machine. And the bad thing is every single build is done on a completely new machine. So it downloads a lot of stuff. So it's also not as quick. Well, perhaps not as fast. It runs slower. It's downloading a lot of stuff. But it's good enough. And if you're a quick starter and you need to get going quickly, this is less set up for anybody. Some of the things that it does for you that would take a lot of configuration on Jenkins. So down here, we're working on a particular GitHub issue, and then check-ins. All right, I've checked in something here, and I've mentioned this issue. So now what we're seeing here is against this issue, the list of commits that were committed against that issue, and automatically Travis has indicated where the commit passed the continuous integration field as well. So we've got a green tick there saying success, CID passed. There's a cross there saying it failed. And he will do that for branches, he will do it for pull requests. Very nice. If you've ever used Maven or some sort of release management software, NPM does that for you. And if you use Git tags for these things, it will automatically create a tag for you, update the numbers in your NPM file. Run change logs is going to create a list of changes from your Git commit messages, and then there's a link in there for all you can. So I suggest you always do a release before you do a deployment. So, why slow? If we take our normal project that we've been developing and we load that up with why slow, this is the sort of thing it looks like. We get a grade D. Very good. Overall performance 70. So we're not using the CDN. You know, we're not expiring headers. We're not adding expires. We're not compressing things. Yeah, we've not minified our JS or our CSS. There's lots of things that we can do. So, Jasmine is one of those tools that that's configured by the Yeoman team. And what that does is puts a block, allows you to put a block in your index.html, give you a list of JavaScript files to include in your application. The syntax here is, this is a build used by Jasmine, and it's a JS block, and I want to create a JavaScript file called vendor.js. The Jasmine pipeline then concatenates, unifies, amplifies it, then adds a content hash based on the output of all of this stuff to the file name, both for JavaScript and CSS. And that's done in the grunt build task. And then there's some tips coming from that stream. Image min and SGV min, minify the images and vector graphics. There's a task in there called replace disk, so you can inject or replace text right in your HTML files. CSS is a nice little one that if you're using Bootstrap can be a pretty big CSS load. What this does is it removes CSS selections that are not really controlled, and that can take your CSS down from 100K or 28K. You have to watch out for dynamically introduced selectors, and there's a syntax for adding those within that task. Also, I've done use engine templates that take all your HTML, Angular templates, concatenate them together, add them as a Angular module that adds into your Angular template cache on startup. So now they're loaded as part of the JavaScript. It also adds them to your existing set of JavaScript files and then recalculates the hash. And then that's the output that you're going to get from your distribution book. You've got an HTML file, you've got an images directory. Each image has got a hash part of the file name, JavaScripts. Again, each one has got its own hash. I suggest keeping our code, the app.js and the vendor.js, all of the libraries that we're using as separate files, each one of those hashed. So when we do a quick bug fix on our code, like we're only updating this one file, we're not having a big JavaScript window. Again, styles, it's a single file there with a hash in it. Anything changes, that hash changes. That means we can add very long styles to all of these things. So, deploying it, copy it to S3. S3 lets you stick enable web on it, so effectively it's just a static HTML website for all your content there. Add content type with a UTF-8 on it, your HTML files, and then the last trick is use CloudFront as a CDN. It's now got a way of doing proxying to your server, right? So you don't need to install and configure an Nginx or Apache. It does require you to use an Amazon ELB, right, which is going to cost you $18 a month, plus the IO of how much you get to use. As you're starting out, you probably have to do that. And that's how it looks in CloudFront. What you're saying is it's just a proxy. Anything with API on the front of it, send it to our server, which is behind our load balancer. We've got a perfect way of now adding up later on, clustering with our server, and the last rule here says anything that's not these two serve from our S3. And CloudFront will distribute it all around the world and give us super fast load performance. And then our overall performance in YSlow will go up to 99. And we lose 1 point because Google Analytics doesn't have a far future expiry date. Okay? We haven't actually had to do very much configuration here. Google's helped us out a lot. And that's it. There's an example project there, and I've tried to put links into that project from the slides. So take a copy, give it a try, and let me know what you think. Any questions?
Good idea.
Yeah. That was a bit long.
Hello? You talk about end-to-end tests and unit tests. Is there any form of integration test where you're testing kind of multiple services together?
Because this was very much a talk focused on Angular, I've just concentrated on unit tests and end-to-end tests. If we're going to do
I was thinking integration test in terms of just the Angular stack. So if you were kind of multiple services calling each other, whether you would kind of integrate a certain proportion of your front-end application, or would you consider that not particularly necessary?
Eventually, you do. Yeah, so I think we want to try and get as much testing as done as quickly as possible. So having our own stuffed services that we're testing as part of using end-to-end as part of our Angular app, I think that's a valuable thing to do. I think also, you're right, we do need to do a full stack test with absolutely everything. But I think that's the next stage after this. Yeah. So if you just consider for the Angular app, we only need to think about just our services. That we created a contract with our service providers and our unit tests. But you're right, we can't just ignore the full stack later on.
This is unlike the Angular group, isn't it?
Well, maybe everybody wants to go to Brazil.
It's
Yeah, you've got plenty of time.
Okay. What are you using to be bundling everything into one file?
And the question is, are we bundling everything into one file to deliver to the browser? Yes. So, I personally have not got into lazy loading modules, okay, because this is another one of those things that's going to change very, very quickly. So, Angular 2 is going to change all of that. So, I personally have just stuck to one big module, one big JavaScript file. You may have to think about that slightly differently, but I have split it out. So, keeping a separate file for all of the vendor libraries, that's the largest one. That's where Angular is in, jQuery, if you're using that, and all of the plugins are all in the vendor.js file. our app is going to be much smaller. And I've also tried to get it to work with IE8, so I kept a shim for IE8 as well. Some people have to think about that.
Any other questions? Go in for a new one.
Hi, you mentioned AWS. Do you use any automated configurations like Arbitrary Jeff, or how do you guys manage the servers?
Repeat that question, please, mate.
Yeah, so for AWS, how do we manage all our servers? In my daytime job, where we're doing lots of Java services, yes, we do a lot of work configuring services using Puppet and deploying systems. But I think the difference is now, I think, introducing these smaller apps with JavaScript, we can think about doing things slightly differently. I haven't talked very much about what's the back end for this deliberately. I mean, we're purely talking about the front end code as though it was a user interface, and that's quite separate from the back end services. And deliberately, this allows you to think about things like blue-green deploys. You can put up, you can do a test deploy to somewhere. We've got specific artifacts that we are mentioning by hash, so we know this HTML file is only going to reference our new code. And we can run that in parallel to the existing one as well. We're not overwriting anything. It all depends on what your back-end services are going to be. Is I think the answer to that. I'd like to make it as simple as possible. If you're just doing a Node back-end server, there's some good examples using a Git push and using push hooks on the server to push to a remote, and that does the install for you and restart the server. But if you're a DevOps person and you're into Puppet, they're going to want to do it their way. Do I git ignore? Yes, yes I do. Yeah. I think the best. The question was, do I git ignore node modules? And yes, I would, but things will disappear, right? So what I'd suggest is running an automated job overnight and back it up. So if something does actually disappear, we've got a copy of it, and then perhaps you're going to have to import that into your project. Yeah, but it's a bit OTT. There's a lot of stuff in. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's what our continuous integration service does as well. It starts from a completely empty directory and does an npm install, which will pull down everything. The danger is that somebody will delete their GitHub account. Somebody will delete some tags from GitHub, and it'll all break. So one day that will happen. So take a backup just in case.
Do you have any advice for breaking up the application to separate node packages?
Any advice on separating out the node application side?
The whole application.
So splitting up your whole application, the Angular side.
Maybe 50 developers working on systems. It's not like a website.
Yeah, well, it's an application. You know, we have to think about how do we modularize all of this. It's just another application that we're going to have to modularize. We're going to have to break it up into services, and we're going to have people focusing on different areas of the application. Trying to get 40 or 50 people around any chunk of code is very difficult. So you're right. You've got to think of it as, you know, how can we split this stuff up so that you've got smaller teams of half a dozen people around a particular area of code.
So I was in the course to do type of flows and stuff, back end, front end.
Yeah.
Have you run into any experience or any problems with that configuration at all, or are you setting everything up on the server?
No. So what I'm suggesting, so the question is do we have if we're deploying an Angular app and a Java backend server, are there any problems doing that? And what I suggest is keep them actually very separate. So we deploy the front end separately from the Java backend, right? So if there's a JavaScript fix, I don't want to have to redeploy the Java server and restart all the apps just because there's one JavaScript fix. Right? This, if you're deploying this onto a CDN, you're sort of switching from the front end, you could deploy your HTML and your JavaScript completely separately from the back end. And I'd suggest that's a good way of doing it. Yeah. Yeah, the question is how do we test directives? There's really good support for testing directives in a unit test. Yeah, so you can compile templates and you can check the contents of the HTML that it's generating. Yeah, that's the way to do it.
Okay, I think that's it. Sorry, Greg. Grab Mick afterwards to answer your question. I think that's it. Thank you very much. Mick.
All right, thank you.
Help yourself to any beers that are left at the back, or cold pizzas.
Tricky question. So what amplifying is, I've never come across that.
It makes it ugly, so it takes all the nice things away. So,
Right, so it's short words. So it's really amplifying.
right?
White cold.
Yeah, I know. That was a, yeah.
We are not we look at sort of looking at like sort of like this so it is sort of like a mobile focus not appropriate. And then what's next? Good for next.
Very much.
Good.
Right. We're about at the hour now, so you're
That's all right. That's all right.
Oh, hang on.